Good afternoon. It's Tuesday, the 8th of December 2015, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio behind the technical desk is Mike Robertson, and we will be joined by live video Skype link by Alex Thompson of Eastern Approaches. Now, I'll just give a little bit of a warning that we have had a few Skype problems this morning, so it may be that we get some delay on the audio from Alex, or alternatively, we may only have audio. We'll try and work through that should it happen. Well, what's the good news? The good news is the sun is shining in Plymouth, Devon, England. We've got reports of sunshine and strong winds from the Isle of Man. Pembrokeshire is looking sunny for those corgis, but London is having a bit of a dingy time. So mixed bag at the moment for England and Wales. We're not too sure of the weather north of the border. No doubt the SNP will be arranging that shortly. Well, we'll kick off with Alex, and you're going to take us through quite a lot of European news today, but starting with Switzerland and some problems with economic matters.
Yes, good afternoon, Brian. I think we're probably going to have to stick to the slides while I'm speaking, otherwise you're going to see me totally out of sync. Now, this is from a Swiss trade journal, Handelszeitung, and the title is Schweizer Exporte nach Russland brechen ein. So the bottom falls out of the Swiss export market to Russia. You may recall that the European Union and Russia have imposed mutual sanctions on each other as a result of Crimea last year. Now, the first result of this was to boost.
And with that, we seem to have lost audio from Alex. Let's just see whether we can bring him back in. Don't know why we've got problems today, whether anybody is playing, but just bear with us. Right, hello, we seem to have at least got audio back, so what we'll do is rejoin Alex Thompson, who was starting off talking about economic woes for Switzerland. Alex, have we got you?
Yes, thanks for calling me back, and we'll try it with just audio, with you putting the slides on screen. I was just saying when the call failed that the headline of this Swiss trade journal says that the bottom has fallen out of the Swiss export market to Russia. I went looking for coverage of this after Mark Anderson remarked on the Swiss rapprochement with Russia last week. And indeed, it turns out that Switzerland only had a temporary peak as a result of the EU export ban with Russia that was imposed after Crimea last year. And the long-term effect was actually not an advantage to Switzerland, but a great big trough in exports due to the weakness of the Russian ruble. The EU is conducting economic war on the Russian Federation, and the Swiss, we must always remember, at the heart of Europe, are not part of the EU, and they're not prepared to be dragged down to the economic abyss together with the EU in its harebrained schemes. So they're marketing their high-quality products to Russia, just like EU countries do with their fine cheeses and wines, except the Swiss are able to take off where the EU left off. One more thing I'd say about this is that here in the Netherlands, I've seen family businesses near me and also near my in-laws fold as a direct result of these sanctions. They used to export lorry loads of very good tomatoes, peppers, and greens, for which the Dutch are famous, straight to Russia. And overnight, that market collapsed, and everyone lost their investments and had to sell up. So the EU's war has rebounded on itself, and the Swiss may take this opportunity to depart from economic liaison with the EU and go towards Russia.
Alex, thank you for that. Obviously, Switzerland suffering as a result of these sanctions. Are you seeing anything reported in the Dutch press or other European press about the failure of European businesses as a result of those sanctions?
Absolutely nothing, Brian. Occasionally you will read in a Dutch trade journal, or I'm a Dutch freelancer now, so I see that kind of material coming. You'll see people complaining on online forums or special journals for freelance businesses that they have no opportunities in Russia. But that's as far as it goes. Unlike Britain, the Continentals do have sometimes parties which become junior partners in government, which are there specifically for business interests. They are businessmen's parties, but even they are not really directing much attention to this scheme, because there seems to be a stranglehold of the EU project over any politician in the Netherlands, or a businessman who turns a politician. They're not free to talk about the reality of what the EU is doing to its own business, for fear of sounding like a French National Front politician, and we come to them later in the programme.
That's a pretty serious statement, Alex, that effectively there's censorship, albeit self-imposed, on these matters, because you're worried if you speak out in Europe you're going to sound like an extremist. This is more than halfway to what presumably the EU is aiming for, is that people are either too frightened to speak out or they're going to be controlled.
That's it. We must never forget in Britain that even the freest continental countries, like here in the Netherlands, have a very, very different approach to politics and journalism and all of public life. You're there to represent the state to the people if you take any professional job, including journalism. And the key words are to be collegial, to show solidarity. These all mean protecting your profession against the questions of the public. That's the key interest that people have in public life in the continental system.
Well, Alex, I've got to add to that. I wonder where we would be now if the Leveson inquiry had gone through as it was obviously planned, which would take us to state control of British press and media. That clearly has failed. But we certainly haven't forgotten that, of course, it was British judges who were involved in that move to clamp down on the press. And later on in today's news, we're going to be coming back onto the subject of the immense power of Britain's judges. But take us into Poland, where they're not all happy, I think is the right way of putting it.
Not at all. Now, Poland is the only country I've visited on my travels where a total stranger came up to me and said, assuming that I was a local, "I'm so glad that such and such won the election. This means a great future for our nation." Now, I forget even whose election it was, but it says something about Polish national identity and coherence as a nation, that much as the British would have been perhaps before the Second World War, you could just assume that anyone you rub shoulders with in public was interested in the fate of the nation. Now, the current party in government is one that the EU hates almost as much as it hates the Hungarian government. The Polish party in power is called Prawo i Sprawiedliwość, or Law and Justice is the usual translation given in English. And the EU really loathes such concepts. The Prime Minister, Beata Szydło, has removed the EU flags from the state chancellery, or rather the Council of Ministers is the name of the building, but it's where the government gives press conferences in the person of the Prime Minister. And here is, probably what you've got on screen is Der Spiegel's slide at the moment, and I thought I'd choose the German coverage for the greatest degree of interest. She's told journalists who noticed that the EU flag had been removed that although she's grateful in these difficult times that Poland is a member of NATO and the EU, nevertheless, the government's weekly press conference is about national Polish issues, and for this reason, she would, with immediate effect, make sure that these conferences took place against, quote, "the background of the loveliest of flags to me, the white and red of the Polish banner." So national interest and national identity has not been eradicated from Poland. The Germans in particular are mad about this. Are you now probably showing the first of these German slides? I've got 3 screenshots for you.
I'll bring them up now. This is
Yes, if you could just dwell on each one for 5 or 10 seconds while I speak, and just go ahead from one to the other. What you're seeing here is screenshots from Zweites Deutsches Fernsehen, which is the German equivalent of the BBC. It's funded by a state tax, much like the BBC is, which is recently introduced because people weren't subscribing to it anymore. What you can see here is that the newscasters give the evening news against a background of what's clearly the EU. You can even see Norway and Switzerland in a different shade. And on the last of these slides, you see the regions of the world depicted as a Eurasia block and an Oceania block and an Americas block. Are you seeing that, Brian?
Yes, that's up on screen at the moment, and I'm watching it myself and thinking this is just fascinated as this supranational state is stitched together in front of our very eyes.
Yes, intolerance of criticism of the EU is famous in Germany, and this is the reason, really, that the German political class has become to regard the EU as its nation. So criticism of the EU is criticism of the national project in Germany. That's why the Alternative für Deutschland party is so fiercely attacked by Merkel and by the press. You can see that if you're watching the evening news, particularly if you're young in Germany and these are your formative years, what you grow up watching, much as I saw Nicholas Witchell and Moira Stewart, presenting a British news programme from what was still in a British perspective, what you grow up now watching in Germany is, here is the EU news for the nation of the EU against the backdrop of the nation called the EU.
What's the difference between the German and the French view of the EU, in your opinion?
The German view has always been one of economic supremacy, and there has been really, they borrowed it. They borrowed all their questionable ideas in Germany from the pre-war British. They borrowed the idea from the first geostrategist, Halford Mackinder, a geographer, that the world was divided into zones, continent-sized zones, and that to control the world, you needed to control Eastern Europe, particularly what's now Ukraine. So really, the German view of the EU is we must have these resources of labour and raw materials, and we mustn't let any other powerful state arise in what they call Mitteleuropa, Central Europe, and we must subsume everything else into that project. The French view, of course, is we must keep France going and avoid a future invasion by Germany by clinging to the German underbelly. So you see, and we'll see this in later slides today, that the two views are diametrically opposed, and they're now falling apart. There's no way of keeping them together anymore.
Alex, these are really important issues, how nation states view the European Union. Am I missing something? Does the Guardian report on this? Does the Telegraph report on this? Have you seen anything of substance in the British press actually talking about the reality of the views of Germans to the EU or the French?
It's completely conspicuous by its absence. Only very rarely does a super journalist like Ambrose Evans Pritchard, whom we're going to come on to shortly, even mention these things. Most of the rest of our journalists are illiterate about these matters. They don't speak German, French, Dutch, Italian, Spanish. They don't read history. They don't know even what happened 40 years ago with our own referendum to confirm our own membership of what was then the common market. And they don't even so much as know that nations have different conceptions of themselves, let alone Europe. I could heartily recommend Peter Hitchens' book, written nearly 20 years ago now, called The Abolition of Britain. You can also get it as an audio book now to listen to in the car or whatever. And he very presciently says there that the British had such comfort for many centuries through their superb constitution and the protection of the sea and the Royal Navy that they never even had to think about the question of national identity. They were just there, and there was no one else competing for the same space. That's not the same on the continent, and every nation has to secure its independence and its future by either opposing or joining the major power of the time. And our historic role as Britain has been to support the minor powers against the encroachments of a major power like a Napoleon or a Hitler. And we seem to have forgotten that now.
We seem to have forgotten it, or it's been driven out of people's heads because, of course, this is not being talked about in schools. So we've got many young people who've not even been educated in a system which is pro their own nationality and culture. Who are these people? What are their views and values? Well, perhaps we get some clue by having a look at Belgium.
Yes, you are probably seeing the chap with the bow tie on screen. This is Elio Di Rupo, who is of Italian descent. He speaks passable French, no Flemish, and very little English. And he astonished people by coming to power as Prime Minister. A hint as to how he got there. is seen in the fact that a Belgian MP, whom you have covered in the past because he brought matters of paedophilia to light in the chamber, was once giving a speech with the Prime Minister present, Elio Di Rupo, and in a kind of pretend slip of the tongue, he said, "Mr. Paedophile, sorry, Mr. Prime Minister." And the Speaker cleared the chamber, ended the session. But he went unpunished, this MP, which says something, doesn't it? Anyway, here we have a Flemish politician of the moderate nationalist party, which I mentioned last week, the N-VA, whose leader is supposedly close to David Cameron. Now, it's been noted by these Flemish nationalists who oppose the EU project and the existence of Belgium that on the 24th of April 2014, just one day after the dissolution of Parliament prior to the last Belgian elections, the last gasp of the Di Rupo government was to give the go-ahead for a new NATO building near Mons in the French-speaking south of Belgium, where SHAPE is the supreme headquarters of Allied Europe, or whatever it's called. I'm sure you know about it from your NATO days. But the cost of this project, say the Flemish politicians, was never factored into the last government's budget. It sounds like someone has got a hold over someone, doesn't it?
It's very interesting, and of course, this is what happens everywhere we dig. We start to find that things are not as they seem. Have we still got Alex? Or
yes, I'm still here.
You're still there. Okay, right, excellent. Yes, what is going on behind the scenes? How are these big contracts actually let or commissioned? There's lots of questions to be answered. And in the forthcoming days and weeks, we're going to be having an in-depth look at the NHS, which is clearly not only being privatised, but of course is being done in such a way that the European Union can get its teeth into very, very lucrative contracts in our public health system. Slight digression there, Alex, but really to agree and say very dirty deals going on. Is it all brown envelopes and money, or is it actually blackmail that's being used?
Yes, and also we should bear in mind that although there are no geographical constituencies on the continent, people still like to do favours for their locals. The Americans call it pork barrel government, don't they, when the senators get deals for their own state. And Di Rupo's own area is very near Mons, in a place called Casteau, where this building is going up. And the Flemish have tartly noted that this guarantees 450 low-schooled jobs to locals who would otherwise be unemployable.
Okay, well, we just follow along with the paedophile subject, and you'd picked up on this article, which is actually relation to Australia, but where we've got a priest who was basically warning off a police officer. I've got a couple of pieces of the text. So we've got Gail Furness, the prosecuting barrister, I believe, said 140 people had made child abuse claims against priests and others in religious orders in the Diocese of Ballarat since 1980. 90% of the claims were against 7 priests, including 78 against Gerald Francis Ridsdale and 15 against Day. And then this was the key bit. Former Mildura police officer Dennis Ryan had already been investigating complaints against the priest Day and would tell the Commission that Taff had warned him in December 1971, drop the inquiry into Monsieur Day or you'll be out of a job. That all smacks true of the things which British police have been saying about the cover-up here. We've added that top title, paedophiles in the establishment and church in Australia, but apparently not UK.
No, you mentioned the UK. Now, at the edge of the UK, in County Londonderry, there was a very similar case at a very similar time. Mike might recall it, having grown up in Northern Ireland. In Clawdy, County Londonderry, there was a bomb that devastated the village in, if I'm not mistaken, 73 or 74. And the priest was transferred across the border, I think, to County Monaghan. And he was later found out to be a wrong one as well as regards children, if I'm right about that. Mike, does that more or less resonate with what you remember?
Yep.
Yep. So there you are. In the early 70s, various parts of the English-speaking world were seeing priests say, lay off my underling priests. So senior Roman Catholic clerics, and Anglicans, by the way, were saying to policemen, lay off my clerics or I will get you out of a job.
And of course, we've seen priests moved from area to area. Instead of bringing them forward for trial, they've simply been moved to a remote location as their punishment within the church for crimes against children.
Yes, it's unspeakable, isn't it? But as usual, the Australians and the Irish take the lead, and the Canadians often too. And the British tend to be the last in the English-speaking world to work out what's been going on.
Okay, well, we'll just remind people, of course, that Lord Janner unfit for trial. So the Mail here, as many of the other papers covering this subject, Labour peer 87 accused of sex attacks, but a judge has ruled that the only thing can happen is a trial of the facts. But it is interesting to look at what the Mail published, because they did this little chronology saying in January 2013, Leicestershire Police launched Operation Enamel, the fourth investigation into allegations against Labour peer. But it wasn't till April 2014 that they requested to speak to him. And hey presto, in this time, despite the fact that he'd been making decisions in the House of Lords, he's suddenly got dementia. We just wanted to ask whether the police had considered that anyone would have reason to drug this vulnerable old man. Alex, there's more to this than meets the eye. I don't know whether you are as suspicious as the UK column.
All I can say about Janner is that I was born in his constituency, in Croft in Leicestershire, and my parents remember him as a particularly sharp and bright man. And this is really the golden thread through everything that's been said about Janner, is that he was so quick-witted. And I'm not a doctor, and I'm not going to deny that sometimes people can really be ravaged by dementia. But it does seem startling that his mental faculties were his unique selling point, his key asset through life, and all of a sudden he's supposedly saying gaga and not recognizing his daughter. This would be the same daughter, would it, who accompanied him to trial a few months ago, and to whom he said, "Ooh, look, what a nice place, daughter."
Yes, this is all part of it. It is incredible, isn't it? Very sharp man, would have made him very clever at what he was doing if he was actually doing something. But we know that across Europe, these paedophile scandals have kept coming to the surface, and they're regularly squashed and quashed with the fact that it's all false allegation. Meanwhile, we only see the arrests of people in lower social classes. Well, let's come back to Europe, and the subject is France and Germany again. But apparently Le Pen is causing some problems.
He certainly is. The French have had their regional elections. Now, these are the equivalent of what we would have had if Prescott had had his way. You would have had the government office of the Southwest with direct elections. Do you recall covering that some years ago, actually, Brian, that Prescott was aiming for that?
I do, but my goodness, there's so much time, water under the bridge.
Yes. Now, this is it. I mean, going back to Hitchens for a moment, this was one of the very few predictions Hitchens made in just before the turn of the millennium that hasn't yet come true, that we would have directly elected regional assemblies. It seems to be one area in which the EU has been turned back in Britain from its plan, at least having had the clock stuck, because they otherwise we would have been on direct elections now. Now, in France and across the continent, they do have these regional elections, and in the northern region of France, the National Front has triumphed. This is Marine Le Pen's party, and as Ambrose Evans Pritchard notes, writing for The Telegraph, many of the areas that have voted National Front are in the centre of the country. We know that the industrial zones and the immigration zones are in the east, or in Burgundy and Lorraine, or even parts of Normandy and Picardy that are not key battlegrounds of France's immigration and culture wars. Now, the lazy knee-jerk reaction on the continent or in Britain to the rise of the French National Front, or indeed to UKIP, is it's all about immigration, people are uncomfortable with immigrants. But no, people, as Pritchard's notes and as French business journals are always saying, the French are bleeding dry. Their industry, particularly the less prominent local industries in village and rural areas, are closing by the week. Ambrose Evans Pritchard is well worth reading, because I'll quote something more from his article here. This is the unique added value of a journalist who can actually read French and German and knows of the country's history. He says France and Germany moved in radically different directions after the launch of the euro. So he's explaining the economic woes in France, which have led to the mass support of the Front National, while Paris introduced the 35-hour working week, so a socialist fantasy of the good life for all. Berlin pushed through the Hartz-IV wage squeeze, which was a law requiring people to do more to get back to work if they were invalidated or whatever, and an internal devaluation within European Monetary Union. And he calls this a beggar thy neighbour strategy. So Germany was basically pricing other countries out of the market. The result is that France has lost 20% in labour cost competitiveness. Nobody, in other words, nobody wants to set up or retain a factory in France or a business of any kind because it's cheaper to employ them in Germany, even though it's a more expensive country, because of the labour costs. France had a current account surplus of 2.5% of gross domestic product at the start of the 2000s, but now it's bleeding national wealth slowly, as is Britain, for different reasons. And Pritchard ends up by saying the Germans are terrified of doing anything that would further bolster Le Pen. They know she poses an existential threat to the Franco-German axis. In other words, the people of France pose an existential threat because they're expressing their national interest, and we can't let that happen, can we?
I'm smiling here. I often do this because I almost don't know what to say. As you see these pieces of the jigsaw come together, that nation states that used to be able to look after themselves, not perfect, but at least people knew where they were born, where their communities were. And of course, manufacturing, a key part of the strength of a nation. And all this destroyed under this cloak of the EU supranational state. But nobody talks about it except your good self and the UK column, it seems, in UK at the moment. But you've also got an article here in relation to the secret life of Bill Clinton. How does that fit into things?
It's the same author, is the point.
All right.
Evans Pritchard has a fantastic career as a journalist. He's the only, you might call him, British patriotic journalist of the Telegraph tradition who can't be ignored by the continents. You've got others who write for the Telegraph or in it, like Christopher Booker, who is superb on some continental issues like child stealing and its links with Britain. But they can be dismissed as one-trick ponies or monomaniacs. Ambrose Evans Pritchard can't, because he was the Telegraph's Washington correspondent in the Clinton years, and he wrote the book which you'll be showing on screen at the moment, The Secret Life of Bill Clinton, available very cheap hardback from retailers such as Amazon and others. You don't have to support Amazon. A lot of people don't like it, but I find it convenient. But you can find it in any number of places secondhand. This book, it didn't bring down Clinton, but it played a major part in his impeachment and the Ken Starr hearings. Because unlike any American journalist based in Washington in the press corps, he actually went out to Arkansas and other places where the Clintons had been doing the rounds and interviewed people. And I have to say, he literally found a trail of bodies. And I'm not misusing the word literally like people tend to do these days. He found all kinds of unsavory stuff. This has been in the open for 20 years now, and the whole of Washington has ignored, probably because he was a Brit, what he had to say. But he's gone from that to covering with the same degree of authority in the Telegraph, in the economic pages, what's happening on the continent. So he needs to be listened to.
Okay, thank you for that, Alex. Well, of course, money makes the world go round, and we believe it's a key part of the control over the political situation in Europe. The French are getting worried about cash and the number of notes in circulation.
Yes, the headline or the subheader there, which you'll have on screen, is more than 1,000 billion euros, so by some reckonings a trillion, are circulating in notes in the Eurozone as of 2015. Well, personally, I wouldn't say that's too many notes for a Eurozone population of well over 200 million people. And the French business paper Les Echos notes this is 12% up on last year. How can this trend be explained? And then begins the hatchet job of all the nasty things that people are doing with cash, like paying their barbers and buying spare parts for their car and whatnot. And the insinuation in every paragraph is that naughty people are using 20 and 50 euro notes to keep things off the books. So I would call that a war on cash.
Of course, cash gives people freedom to do with their money what they think they should do. Mike?
Yeah, Alex, my observation would just be that probably 50% of the French economy is a black economy. The vast majority of transactions done are in cash in France still, and people, I mean, the French tax regime, you were talking about the deindustrialization of France earlier and the difficulty in employing people in France. The tax regime over there has to be part of that because it is pretty destructive. Of course, they've got a pretty impressive social security system as well, but nonetheless, I would say probably about 50% of what happens over there is done in cash and on the black.
Yes, and you see similar love for cash, even in countries which don't have so much of a black market like Germany. Very, very different to other Germanic countries, actually, because here in the Netherlands or in Denmark, they're getting very close to banning cash. And people will, even in government offices, refuse a couple of tenors as payment for a document or whatnot. Whereas in Germany, you can actually walk into a hi-fi store or a furniture store and lay down 9,000 euros or so to buy a high-cost item.
Okay. And with that, it looks like Alex has disappeared. Okay, what we'll do...
I'm still here.
Oh, you are?
Yes.
Sorry. Okay, I'm just going to move us on a little bit. I've got an eye on the clock at the moment. So we've got interesting things happening with the money supply. Of course, a big push to go to electronic money. If it's electronic, you are totally controlled in your spending. We've also got the regionalisation. You mentioned Prescott and the trial at the elected regional assemblies in UK, but this is moving forward at some speed in Europe, including France.
What I've noticed, Brian, and I'll keep it quick from now on, is that this article, which was written last summer, prior to the last French regional elections, which have just happened, explains how the French regions designed in 1982 were recarved over dinner last year, literally. The article describes how the president and the prime minister, Manuel Valls, redrew the French map entre le fromage et le dessert, between the cheese and the dessert. And one of the consequences that they envisaged, which even the French couldn't stomach, was that they were going to abolish Brittany, a 1,200-year-old Celtic nation with its own region within France, was going to be merged with the Loire. And it took a couple of furious text messages from Bretons to stop this happening. But the casualness with which a dictator at the centre can redraw the map is something that should be truly frightening to us. It happened at exactly the same time last summer, that the Dutch and the Italians all supposedly spontaneously said we must rationalise and reduce our number of regions, abolish the historical provinces to which people have attachments like the counties in Britain, and replace them with homogeneous sizes of region. I note that all these regions have a kind of sweet spot population of about 4, 5 or 6 million people. That's obviously what someone deep in the European Commission has calculated as the ideal regional population to avoid posing any threat to the centre. So that's probably what we have coming up ahead of us in Britain as well.
Absolutely. People being taken out of the comfort zone. So history, historical, social connections, these are all to be broken as you bring in these politically defined common areas. Well, of course, on a bigger scale, it's happening to nation states, and that would lead us nicely into the Ukraine here, I think.
Yes, a lot of people in our interest area, alternative media, have, I think, a rather too simplistic narrative of Ukraine. They're certainly not wrong to describe the Western Ukrainian forces as neo-Nazi that are in eastern Ukraine. There's plenty of documentation on the savagery that they've been up to. But we need to bear in mind that both sides fighting in eastern Ukraine contain soldiers who have really an outrageous hatred of Christianity and churches. Even these Cossacks who form part of the units loyal to Russia in Lugansk and Donetsk, because here, this is taken from a Facebook post of a church member in Lugansk Oblast, in a place called Krasny Luch, you can actually see that Cossacks, ostensibly fighting for the pro-Russian side or the anti-Kiev side or whatever you want to call it, plundered a Protestant church and burned down its library and actually took out some armfuls of New Testaments and made a bonfire, well, a cooking fire to serve their lunch on. So we have to bear in mind that there is atrocities going on both sides. And just as with the Balkans 20 years ago, it seems that nobody in Western Europe is much concerned about it.
Okay.
I'm here.
Go ahead.
Yeah, that's it. That's what I have to say about Ukraine.
Okay. Well, Christianity is the hot topic at the moment. A lot of people contacted the UK column about this article. I've chosen the Telegraph here, but the headline says it all. Britain is no longer a Christian country and should stop acting as if it is, says judge. Well, that judge, Lady Butler Schloss, she had headed up a major inquiry into the place of religion in modern society, and apparently she's provoked a furious backlash from ministers and the Church of England. Well, we've taken quite a look into this, and we're not convinced by what we're being told in the mainstream media. This was part of the Telegraph report. It's said that the central recommendation is for a national consultation exercise to draw up a 21st century equivalent to the Magna Carta, to define the values at the heart of modern Britain instead of the government's controversial British values requirement. So here we've got Butler Schloss supposedly looking at Christianity. No. What we're doing is completely rebuilding the Constitution. And she says, from recent events in France to the schools so many of our children attend, and even the adverts screened in cinemas, for good and ill, religion and belief impacts directly on our daily lives. Well, our look into what's been going on here is to come to the conclusion that this is a massive attack on Christianity and indeed the constitution of the country. We're not alone. Christian Today put out this report saying that the new Butler Schloss religion report destroys our nation's defence against evil. Well, while we might agree with that statement, and it's an article which I encourage you to look at, of course it is only too true, because let's remind ourselves of this Mirror headline: Christianity has no place in the British Army, claims a senior military officer. This gentleman is involved with the National Secular Society. And of course, it's been the UK column alone that keeps coming back to the fact that the British government approved Satanism for use on board warships in the Royal Navy. So let's have a look at that. Well, of course, Tony Blair was Prime Minister. This is the published evidence. This policy of Satanism at sea was brought in. And these are the key military and defence figures who were in post at the time. And our question remains, are these the people that approved Satanism for use in the British Armed Forces? So let's come back to the Telegraph article. We just wondered who had actually carried out this report. And we're looking at the Commission on Religion and Belief in British Public Life. And what people need to know is the Commission has come out of the Woolf Institute. And we're going to take an in-depth look into these organisations to see what's really been going on. Alex, I'm just going to work through this and then I will bring you in for comment. Let's just see how this runs. Well, of course, the Jewish Chronicle, very glowing in its praise of the work by two top judges. That's Woolf himself and Butler Schloss. They say, well, this is very, very good work. And of course, what they're doing is supporting diversity and improving relations between all the major faith groups in Britain. We're not convinced. And we're going to say to our audience today, this is where everybody needs to get digging into what we're being told by the mainstream press. Here he is, Lord Woolf, 82, served as the most senior judge in England and Wales for 5 years until 2005. Here's the Woolf Institute. It's named in honour of the Right Honourable Lord Woolf. And it was also founded by Dr. Edward Kessler, described by the Times Higher Education Supplement as probably the most prolific figure in interfaith academia. We can't sort out faith as individuals, we need experts. Well, this is all about the Woolf Institute. It studies the relationships between Jews, Christians and Muslims, and it's going to enhance our understanding of key concepts of public life. We were interested in the terminology because the teaching and research examines a common purpose. We don't think this is accidental, and this is the real common purpose of a type we've seen in the quasi-political charity common purpose. But don't worry, because the Woolf Institute is independent, or so they would have us believe. Well, what else can we tell you? Inside the Woolf Institute is yet another organisation, the Centre for Policy and Public Education, formerly the Centre for Public Education, and they are working with everybody, public sector bodies, NHS, the police, local government, private and third sector organisations. So the message is really relaxed. The Woolf Institute is going to structure public policy, our education and our constitution, it would appear, and Christianity. It's just the public haven't been told. So if we put the pieces together, we end up with quite an interesting network of vested interests. So let's bring in the Commission on Religion and Belief in British Public Life, of course headed up by Butler Schloss. And what is the result? Well, we should really remove the Christian priority within Britain. Britain no longer a Christian country. Well, we were curious as to where the funding came from for this, but we were quickly told that amounts were secret, even though we can reveal who is funding the commission. Wolf Institute, not surprisingly, also Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust. But we were fascinated to see that George Soros, the great international financier, is also using Open Society money to help this work of Butler Schloss. So here's the Wolf Institute, and let's have a look at the connections. We've got the Faculty of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies. We've got Cambridge Theological Federation, St Edmund's College, Master of Studies, Jewish Christian Relations, Cambridge Commonwealth European and International Trust. And remember, all of this is buried inside Cambridge University. But then it gets interesting because we've got overseas connections, the American University in Washington, D.C. And how about this? Prince Al-Walid bin Talal Centre for Islamic Studies in Cambridge, which nicely leads us to Al-Walid Philanthropies in Saudi Arabia. So interesting that we can now rely on the Saudis with their wonderful human rights record to be helping change the way faith is in UK. And if that isn't enough to convince you something untoward is here, have a look at the Doha International Centre for Interfaith Dialogue in Qatar. Same thing, we've got immensely powerful organisations and money coming in through Cambridge University, basically to say we need to move on from Christianity. Well, if we follow it through, there's the Centre for Policy and Public Education. Don't worry, they're managing what's happening with the Wolf's inquiry, and it's in good hands here with Mohammed Abdulaziz, formerly advisor of Race, Religion and Community Cohesion for the Department for Communities and Local Government. So in that mix, we've got immensely powerful corporations via George Soros. We've got overseas countries with appalling human rights records. But we've also got two closely linked judges in Judge Wolf and Butler Schloss. Just to prove that we did our homework, we basically emailed them to say, can you tell us how much the three organisations have given in funding? And very quickly, they came back with it's not relevant exactly which organisations provided how much money. There is full disclosure as to our funders. The commission was a major undertaking and the secretariat was provided by the Wolf Institute, who were therefore the main backers. So this is obfuscation. These people don't want to talk about the amounts of money coming in from, for example, George Soros. Alex, I'm going to say that this is political. This is political hands at work backed by big money. This is not the case of a Wolf Commission report.
Yes, Brian, I would thoroughly agree with that, because what else would unite nominal Jews, nominal Christians, and nominal Muslims in an attempt to remove the Christian constitution of Britain, other than a political interest internationally in having the monarchy and the rest of the breaks, such as the House of Lords, removed from the agenda. Otherwise, there is always going to be, as Cameron has found, as you covered recently with his battles with the Lords, there's always going to be a break on what he can do. But if we are a secularist republic with the House of Commons as effectively a unicameral legislature, there is no such break anymore on his ability to do as he's told by his masters. I would say that I can lay claim to having slowed down Cambridge University's agenda to secularize Britain by 1 hour. Let me explain. When I was a student it would have been 97, my immediate room neighbour across the corridor was Professor Beatson, who we'll talk about in a moment. Now, that afternoon I had a Ceilidh band organised, and being a carefree Cambridge student, I had the whole Ceilidh band come to my room. And there was an angry knock on the door, and an august figure said, "I can't study, I'm trying to work." And it only dawned on me 15 or 20 years later that my then roommate pointed out to me that this figure was Professor Beatson, who had since become an important law lord, I think it is, or certainly a legal bigwig, who had ruled that Britain was a Christian country and that the only problem was the population hadn't been told yet. So he will have been writing a paper to that effect when my bagpipes disturbed him, for which I am justly proud.
So questions to be asked here about what the university's actually doing. We're seeing this more and more. London School of Economics, supposedly a place of learning, but what you've actually got is political policy being made. But in this particular case, a lot of questions need to be answered. Let's just follow through a bit more. It gets more and more interesting as you go. This is the government's Foreign and Commonwealth Office man, Dr. Edward Kessler, Vice Chair of the Commission on Religion and Belief in Public Life, chaired by Baroness Butler-Schloss. And he's been sitting on the Foreign and Commonwealth Office Advisory Group on Freedom of Religion and Belief. And he regularly teaches Foreign and Commonwealth Office staff on how and why religion can fundamentally affect policy. So this is the man driving government policy, which is then using his institute to come out with what they claim is an independent report undermining Christianity. Well, what is the church doing? Well, this is a very interesting man to have a look at. Justin Welby, we say he's working in the shadows to destroy his own church. Why do we say that? Because if we look at the Wolf Institute patrons, surprise, surprise, we find the Right Honourable Justin Welby, Archbishop of Canterbury, on it. If we look at reports on that commission, we will also find that Justin Welby was actually interviewed. So he was part of the setting up, then he's interviewed, and then where do we go from that? Well, apparently the Church of England says the report was a sad waste and had fallen captive to liberal rationalisation. But this is very puzzling since the Archbishop of Canterbury was part of the very team. So here he is, proud of the report, which has ultimately led to the headline that Britain is no longer a Christian country. This was done in a few hours yesterday, but I've got to say, Alex, the deeper you dig, the more outrageous any claims of independence in this are. These people are all linked, they're all networked, they're all receiving what I believe vast amounts of funding from overseas, including Saudi Arabia, Qatar and Soros, and they're telling us what our faith should be.
It's astonishing, Brian, and I think to me the involvement of Saudi and Qatari money is the proof that there is no religious agenda here, because if they were acting as Muslims in line with their Islamic duty, they would certainly want to Islamize Britain from a position of its being Christian by law and practice, and not from a position of its being a secularist republic. So the fact that Saudi and Qatari money is going into the disestablishment of religion in Britain is a proof to me that they're acting as they are in other spheres, such as Syria, in rather terms of filthy lucre rather than of religion. I was fascinated just there to see that Archbishop Gregorius, the Archbishop of Thyatira, was on that commission. And I've just quickly thumbed to what the book of Revelation says about the church in Thyatira. God says, "I have a few things against thee, because thou sufferest that woman Jezebel, which calls herself a prophetess, to teach and to seduce my servants to commit fornication. All the churches shall know that I am he which searches the reins and the hearts, and I will give unto every one of you according to your works." I think the bishop ought to read the letter written to his own congregation.
What can I say? I would agree, but that'll lead us in very nicely to problems with the Bible. But before we get there, this post you sent through, I'm not sure whether it's a Facebook post or part of a tweet. I think it's much too big for a basic tweet, but I'll read it out. A gentleman called Paul Cooper said 4 big Muslim guys arrived in Keswick today, driving around in a black car, real suspicious jihadi looking fellas with black beards. They went to the Christian Convention Centre and parked up outside just as I arrived to drop off some bits and bobs. Then they got out and delivered loads of food parcels and gifts for the people who'd lost everything in the floods. They were heading to Carlisle next to do the same. I thought I'd mention it because things like this don't appear in the Daily Mail or the Sun. They were just regular guys out looking to help people. And I just can't help annotating this, that when you think about this, the social conditioning here is really quite powerful. Big black beards equate to Islamic terrorism. And on the other hand, the person's also saying that the government's social conditioning is blocking the real human interest stories from coming into the mainstream press and media. This is quite a wonderful piece of text, Alex.
I love it, Brian. I think even from an economic point of view, and I'm sure David Scott would heartily agree if he was on today, one can only admire these Muslims because unlike most of the churchgoers in Britain, when they realized that there was a charitable need, they didn't pray for the government to do something, nor did they entrust the matter to large charities with large staffs. No, they got in their cars, presumably from Bradford or Manchester, or even from Glasgow for all I know, and they sped up or down the M6 to Cumbria and delivered the aid themselves. What a remarkable achievement. Charity without the involvement of government or of bloated religious bodies. And as for the significance of Keswick, I don't know whether the gentlemen themselves will be aware of this, but that was the most important Christian revivalist centre in Britain for the last century. A lot of people owe their conversion to meetings held there. And I think these gentlemen were well aware that when push comes to shove, you don't trust the government, you help as Muslim to Christian.
I agree with that. Let's have a look at this Metro article, which is just fascinating. What happens when you read people the Bible but tell them it's the Quran? This is an article about what is joke. It describes a bit of a joke. They decided to put the Bible in a Quran's cover, read out bits of the Bible. People believed it was the Quran, and then they were interested in the reply. So bottom right on screen, we've got some of those. How could anyone believe in this? It's unbelievable. The world is changing. I think they should have to adapt. I've been raised with this book, and these kinds of thoughts is going to influence the way you think. So this was deceptive to apparently see how people reacted to the Bible. But of course, ultimately, it is undermining both the Muslim and Christian religions. There's a YouTube video on this. I just took a couple of screenshots since the recent events in Paris and the association between ISIS and the Islam. Here we've got a rally. The Islamic belief has been under constant scrutiny. On it goes. Muslims have been accused of following a religion that's no place in our Western culture. And then all of a sudden, this made us wonder, what about Christianity? This is pretty devious stuff going on here, Alex.
Yes, Brian. The thing that I would stress is that it taps into a long tradition of the secular part of Dutch society, which is a small and vocal minority, pretending to represent the Netherlands and knowing very well that they will be picked up abroad and recast as the voice of reason and representative of the Dutch nation. They're not. That first slide you showed with the girl with the rather blank expression saying, "I can't believe it." In the video, she says, "Well, I even went to a Christian school." And that's the point, isn't it, Brian? People are inured to the contents of the Bible and the Quran because, especially if they've gone to a Christian school in Britain or the Netherlands, they'll never have opened a Bible. It's the Christian school is just a piece of show. And definitely this is lumping together Christians and Muslims. We should prepare to suffer a persecution together, I think. And the Muslims are much more aware of this than most Christians are.
Right. Well, of course, the objective that we see worldwide is division between nation states and religions. That is part of the clash of civilizations. Massive movement of people in Europe. Again, it's the fear factor. So we're going to end on the fact that we've taken you behind the scenes to show how political and money hands are driving the agenda in UK. We're seeing that people in Europe are saying no, are speaking out. Where will it end unless we do something about it? Well, let's just have a look again at the machinery of David Cameron's fascist conservative state, because based on the fear that is constantly being whipped up, what is he bringing into power? That people should be fearful of each other, ramp up the fear and encourage people to spy on each other. Then we bring in the means to prevent the terrorism. But what is this? It's really targeting children and young people it's alienating parents, and ultimately it's giving much more power to the state and social services. In come the documents protecting vulnerable people from terrorism. What has that done? Created a multi-agency spy committees through NGOs and charities. And here we've got the MAPA organisation, immensely powerful, formalised secret state spying and arrest. And of course, they can section you and hold you under mental health rules. So this is very, very serious stuff. Our message is that people in Britain of all colours, faiths, creeds have got to stick together. It is ultimately the state that is the danger. Alex, I'll leave you with a final couple of words.
Yes, we came to a head there with the spiritual matters, didn't it? And the issue there is who understands the content of the Bible or the Quran. Well, if you're a believer in the Bible, or for that matter in the Quran, then it's your responsibility to tell people what's in it. If you don't, then you've got no excuse if people are easy prey for this kind of stunt on the street.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Alex. We will leave it there. Serious and very dark things unfolding, of which a massive attack on Christianity and indeed the Muslim faith in UK. What is the agenda? A dictatorship. We'll leave you to think about that today. We will be back same time tomorrow. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.